Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Sustainable Development Panel. Jackie, do we have any apologies?
Chair, no, we've got no apologies. Everybody's here. Thank you.
Do we have any declarations of interest? No? Okay. So should we take the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 15th of January? First of all, can we accept these as a correct record, please? Councillor Davis, you've got a point to make.
It's okay. I've seen Councillor Maxwell has indicated. I think we have the same point to make.
Councillor Maxwell. You need to unmute, Councillor Maxwell.
Got it. Yeah, on the first page of the page 5 of the meeting, it's the minutes from the 15th of January. The next to the bottom paragraph says the covered by the plan, which has been exempted from 2036 to 203. It should read 2038.
That's correct. Thank you for that, Councillor Maxwell. A very important detail.
Oh, thanks.
No, it's important. Okay. Are there any other corrections to the minutes? Can we take them as a correct record, please? Yep. No one's saying that we can't, so we'll accept those. They're agreed. Okay, let's move on to item 4 now, and this is the Greater Norwich Local Plan, and Graham Nelson's going to lead us through it, I believe. Graham, over to you.
Thank you and good morning. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
I've got a slight technical problem. I can't see everybody. I've got 9 people on the screen at once, but anyway, if there's any questions, please just shout. Yeah, this report just brings you up to speed with the latest developments in relation to the Greater Norwich local plan. As you were aware, it's a joint local plan that you last considered in January at your meeting in advance of cabinet endorsement of the previous Regulation 18 draft. And there was a meeting of the Greater Norwich Development Partnership, which is the sort of combined body from the 3 councils with the county and the Broads Authority also involved in it, met a couple of weeks ago, and what the report that you have in front of you summarises the 3 reports that are available online via the GNDP website. By way of a precursor to this, we started with an analysis of where we were in terms of how long the GNLP has been in preparation, and just repeating some of those things in the minutes from the last time we met in January about some of the overall concerns that the City Council had read with the direction of travel in relation to the Greater Norwich local plan, and those were reiterated effectively by our members at the Greater Norwich Development Panel. The first report that the panel considered when it met a couple of weeks ago was a sort of one on the overall level of response to the Greater Norwich local plan. The figures are set out on page 11 of your agenda paper. Effectively, it feels like a whole world away because of what we've been dealing with in COVID in the intervening time. But the timing of the Greater Norwich local plan consultation was unaffected by the lockdown. Effectively, it enjoyed quite a decent level of response in terms of both the strategic policies within the plan and on the individual sites that were proposed. A far lesser number of comments were received in relation to the detailed evidence base that had been prepared. But overall, there's a pretty hefty level of response that needs to go through. That paper clearly summarised the main issues to it, and I think the issue to draw out, it wasn't just the City Council who had raised concerns along the lines that we had. They were shared by quite a number of other people who responded. Yes, and the other thing we note in relation to this point is that we provide a paragraph 10 of the report on page 12, just an update in terms of the Central Norfolk Strategic Housing Market Assessment, which is no longer called that, but that's due to be refreshed over this current year. That takes us into the second report of the GNLP, and for a variety of reasons, it is suggested that the timetable for the local plan needs to be revised. The principal reason for that is we're in very different economic circumstances now to where we were in January, and actually I think we need to get our understanding in line about the economic impact of COVID and what's that going to do, for instance, to housing demand especially. So there are certain key bits of evidence for the local plan that now needs to be updated. That necessitates a change to the timetable, effectively to put it back. The previously agreed timetable and the proposed revised timetable that now exist are set out at the top of page 13 of your agenda paper. You will see at the outset of that, the key things for us is now we're, instead of working for the submission of the Regulation 19 plan at the back end of this year in November, that has now slipped and it's unlikely to be submitted until the summer of next year. To allow that work to be done. That opens up the scope for a further round of consultation to sense check some of our evidence in relation to COVID-19 and particularly to reflect the progress that the County Council is making in relation to its transport initiatives and the Transport for Norwich strategy, and to allow the authorities to consider possible allocation of schemes in particular and consult on those things in the autumn to gain people's views prior to submission. The thing that was subject of some certainly internal debate is the timetable following the submission. You will see that actually the timetable on the right-hand side hopes to comparatively speed up the process following submission compared to the previous timetable. Whether that will be deliverable really is outside of our control largely, because it will depend on the planning inspectorate and how quickly they are able to deal with such a complex plan. My experience tells me that that plan following June 2021 there is somewhat optimistic, and the planning inspectorate may struggle to deliver in accordance with that. But as you know, and the final paper deals with, the government is looking at significantly changing the planning system. We're told there will be further policy papers coming out shortly on the matter, and they're also trying to look very much at speeding up some of the processes of the planning inspectorate. So if they achieve that timetable on the seeing adoption of the plan by November, December 2022 may in fact be deliverable. But at this moment, under current procedures and the current track record of the inspectorate, I would suggest that is ambitious. I think I would describe it as politely. And the final report is the that was made at the GNDP. Sorry, before we just move on, the thing I probably ought to say is that revised timetable set out in the paper was actually agreed by the Greater Norwich Development Partnership, so that we would ordinarily now expect to update our local development scheme in the autumn, which is the formal document, and that should come back to you once we've updated it. So that will happen. And the final report that was also taken to the GNDP was a sort of looking at the key aspects of emerging government policy regarding the planning system, and currently there's an awful lot going on. The paper that was clearly now written 3 or 4 weeks ago looks like it's a bit of a work in progress, because the government's come out with some announcements recently about further deregulation to the planning system, additional permitted development rights to allow flats to be extended upwards in certain instances, and they're talking about further deregulation coming forward in terms of introducing further permitted development rights to allow existing commercial buildings to be demolished and rebuilt under some equivalent prior approval process. And more broadly speaking, they're talking about, policy papers to set the future direction of government planning policy. They're clearly thinking that that certain aspects of the planning system seems to be inconsistent with the build mantra that came out of part of the COVID response from the Prime Minister. So we don't know what the future holds in terms of how the planning system is going to exist, what we're necessarily going to have control over or influence over, or particularly to what extent the government is viewing the planning system as a positive asset in which to promote and drive regeneration and development, or to what extent it is looking to carry on some of its previous initiatives in terms of just trying to sort of deregulate and reduce the scope for involvement of the planning process. I've got to say, from my perspective, it's pretty difficult to get a clear steer on what that direction of travel is at the moment, because there's certain initiatives that the government have been strongly supporting, like the report of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, that suggests a far more a detailed and prescriptive approach, whereas on other sides of the equation there seems to be things coming out that suggest a far more deregulatory approach. So I await the policy paper with interest. But the report today before you effectively just tries to bring you up to speed on what's been going on, because clearly in the current climate we've not been able to meet physically and brief people and answer questions as we might have otherwise been able to do. So it's just bringing you up to speed with the progress in relation to the Greater Norwich local plan. Judith, can you jump in if I've missed anything? And if not, I'm perfectly happy to take any questions.
Right, I saw Karen, then I saw Judith. So we'll start going through questions, and just put your hand up if you want to get on the list. Karen. Sorry, Councillor Davis.
Thank you. Graham, I really welcome this Article 4 direction paper. As you'll know, I have been banging on about it for a while in SDP. What powers do we actually have, though? Sorry?
Karen, we're still on item 4.
Yes, we were talking about the permitted development as part of this, weren't we?
Okay, that's
so
fine.
it's just a general question about this.
That's fine.
So
Okay.
if we look at the government obviously trying to put through deregulate planning, what actual powers as a council do we have under an Article 4 direction, and can they be overruled?
The Article 4 direction, I think this is linked to this question, because it revolves around the direction of future planning policy and how the deregulation may work. Currently, there is a permitted development right to convert offices to flats effectively. Now that's recently been amended so that there's a greater range of consideration that can be given to those schemes, because I think the government was somewhat embarrassed that a commercial building, I think it was in Watford, was able to be converted to 7 flats without any windows in the building, effectively. So they were entirely artificially lit. So the government has, over the time since they introduced this permitted development right, has gradually increased the number of tests that can be applied to it. When it was first introduced, we could only consider whether there was a health and safety issue, whether the transport policies applied to it, and whether it was in a flood risk zone. Subsequently, noise has been added, and now they've added issues of effectively amenity for the future occupiers of there. There's still, within that, is some scope for pretty poor standard of residential flats being provided. But to turn to your question, Councillor Davies, you know, what we're proposing, an Article 4 direction is the ability of the local council to restrict those permitted development rights that the system's given. So you've got a right to do something, it's the council taking that away. That can be challenged through the process, so we'll have to have the right evidence in place if we want to withdraw any of those permitted development rights through the process. So you effectively need a strong case. But once you have withdrawn it, those rights are withdrawn, and that means that if anybody wants to do anything that they've required, you've removed those permitted development rights for, they'd have to submit a planning application. If not, they could have enforcement action taken off if they go ahead and do it anyway. But the challenge to the process is that they'd have to submit a planning application, but we'd obviously then, as a council, have to determine that in accordance with the development plan or material considerations as they exist at the time. And if any applicant is unhappy that they've been refused planning permission, they can always challenge that through the planning inspectorate. So I think that answers part of your question. I think the other aspect of it is where we're heading in terms of future permitted development rights, which is sort of relation to the paper. It is one of the aspects of pushing ahead with the Article 4 direction in the way that we are proposing is it might not be sensible to introduce an Article 4 direction to restrict the ability to change use from offices to residential if the government is pushing ahead with introducing a further permitted development rights to allow buildings to be demolished and potentially rebuilt. That we'll just have to keep an eye on that as it proceeds. My own instinct is that, particularly because of the circumstances in Norwich, I think it is unlikely, and it would certainly be quite alarming if the government extended permitted development rights to allow the office blocks within the city centre, within the conservation area, to be demolished and rebuilt without any planning control. That would be a very significant impact for the city, and if that goes ahead, then it does really open up a sort of lack of control and free-for-all, which sits very uncomfortably with a lot of other aspects of what the government is proposing, and certainly would undermine our own efforts to actually make sense of that Article 4 direction and stimulate the office market in the city centre and use that as part of our drivers for the COVID-19 recovery. Sorry, that's a rambling answer, but does that answer the point?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks, thank you, Graham. Judith, you're next.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I want to go back to the public consultation on the GNLP, and on page 12, paragraph 8, you mentioned the comments from Historic England about the whether or not the planning framework is sound enough for the historic environment of the city. I mean, could you just explain a bit more, if you can remember, what that comment was about?
Yeah, I can actually, because it's specific. It's one of the matters that's on our work list to get back and discuss with Historic England. But their point that is around tall buildings in the city centre. They are particularly concerned at the absence of either a specific policy to address tall buildings in Norwich city centre, or a supplementary planning document specifically addressing height issues. And their argument in relation to the Greater Norwich local plan was that the plan was unsound without that specific degree of guidance. I think I ought to comment that the general background to this is clearly we've always regarded that there's some current protected views of where high buildings would be restricted in our identified in our own local plans, and we obviously have quite a detailed conservation area appraisal which provides, in our view, a pretty sound base for identifying where high buildings aren't acceptable. We're aware that a number of cities have produced specific guidance on high buildings and how they can be incorporated within historic cities, but we've been slightly reluctant to do an additional exercise with to address that at this point, because we've seen the prospects of actually reaching an agreement with Historic England about its content would be frankly remote. Just to put that in context, over the past few years, we've seen a number of significant height buildings come forward in Norwich, including most noticeably some of the student accommodation, Barn Road, All Saints Green and Queen Street, those student blocks, as well as a few years previously to that, the recladding and increase of height of Westlegate Tower. Historic England objected to all four of those proposals, even though once all four of those proposals now they're built, I think I feel comfortable with how they fit into the cityscape, and particularly I think the tallest of those buildings is the student accommodation on All Saints Green. I find it difficult for anybody to argue how that isn't a significant improvement to the conservation area in terms of its design quality, both what it does for the skyline of Norwich when looked from further afield, but also what it does to the street scene on All Saints Green and the appearance of the sensitive listed buildings the other side of the street. So it's been on the list of potential things to take forward, but we've been very wary of doing so because of the potential for further conflict with Historic England on the matter. Clearly, I think everybody's in the room is also aware that that issue of a disagreement between the City Council, the way it sees high buildings, and Historic England was brought into sharp relief by the Anglia Square inquiry that went earlier in this year. We're told that we may get the Secretary of State's decision on that by the 7th of September. That's the deadline that the Secretary of State effectively gives himself to make that decision. And clearly, once the inspector's report comes out and is published on that, I think that will probably be a helpful tool from which to have further discussions with Historic England and see if we can sort of work out an approach to how we resolve that issue. So from my point of view, I think the attitude of Historic England, it's been difficult to work out where they would come from in terms of where high buildings would be acceptable. So we'd be going through, if we followed their approach, we were producing the document that said, frankly, you couldn't build high buildings anywhere in Norwich city centre, and that doesn't feel like the right approach. Don't get me wrong, there are clearly, and we haven't fought many appeals on this or done anything else, but in quite a number of sites behind the scenes, we've advised developers that we think they are the wrong place for high buildings, many of them in the river valleys, you know, where, as you can see, where the civic and ecclesiastical buildings particularly dominate the skyline. So around the centre, clearly it's the wrong place for high buildings in the city. They would be quite harmful to it. But there are places within the city centre where we think some height can actually add value, as well as delivering a sustainable form of development. And it's teasing that issue out. But we'll need to come back to that issue following the receipt of the inspector's report on the Anglia Square development.
Oh, well, thank you very much for the very full response. And yeah, it'd be good to know the outcome by September, hopefully, of the Anglia Square, because it'll either be, well, good news, bad news, and we'll probably have another headache one way or another. And then further on in paragraph 10, the need to have a new housing needs survey or study, and we're dependent on the government coming forward with the standard methodology for doing it. Is there a risk that won't come forward before the timetable in which we need to do it?
There's always a risk that it won't come forward, but I don't know. I mean, yes, there is a risk. We are in the hands of the government. They may, as a result of some of their policy papers that they're due to publish within the month, say that they're going to change the approach to this. It would be a very sharp change for the government to do this, because the way they've structured the development management system, whether you can demonstrate a 5-year land supply and can demonstrate that against the quantifiable, objectively assessed need that they've determined by the methodology, is a significant planning consideration as they've structured the planning system. So unless they do something especially radical in their policy papers that are due out over the next month, I think the system that they have created rather requires that to be done. So whilst it may have, well, it has been delayed, because I think the previous timetable was that expected that methodology to be published in June. I would be surprised if it weren't issued in the autumn, frankly, but I'm frequently surprised by a lot of stuff that does go on these days, so I don't know if that will be the case. And yeah, certainly even if they don't do that, I think it's vitally important the City Council keeps on top of its understanding its own housing need, both in quantitative terms, but particularly in the light of COVID-19, how that affects different groups and requires different solutions in terms of some of the specialist accommodation for supporting getting homeless people off the streets, some specialist groups and supported housing categories. And generally, I think the housing needs assessment that we produced in 2017, while it's useful, I think it is time for an update and a refresh. So it does need it. You do need to do these things regularly, because I think, particularly bearing in mind what we've seen over the past 6 months, I think it's very likely that needs for affordable forms of housing are going to increase quite dramatically over the coming months.
Thank you again. And the last 2 points are really just for clarity. In paragraph 14, under the revised timetable, you talk about the East Norwich master plan that has been approved. I think it's the Coleman site and the area around.
It is.
The
East Norwich master plan is intended to cover all of the Carrow Works site up to King Street. So it includes the Carrow House site, which is in the ownership of the County Council, as well as the Deal Ground and the Utilities site. And that some of those go, so it's worth noting, just go outside of the city. So parts of the area of the East Norwich master plan go into South Norfolk and also go into the Broads Authority.
Yeah, and finally, in the last paragraph, the Greater Norwich Local Nature Recovery Strategy. I'm sorry to say that's a new one on me. I've missed it somewhere along the line. Can you just briefly explain what that is?
No is the short answer. Sorry, it's a new one on me as well. I don't know if there's any of the other officers in on the call. I don't know if Judith can help me out on that, but that's as much news to me as it is to you.
It's we haven't got one yet, but it's something that's being introduced through the Environment Bill, and obviously that bill hasn't been enacted yet. And I believe it's, you know, I'm not quite sure when it's coming back to the Commons, but that's part of that, and there will be a requirement to produce a local nature recovery strategy. So that's all I know at this point.
Right.
But we'll probably something we can feed back to you on later on in the as this develops. But
you're saying it's required to produce the Greater Norwich Local Nature Recovery Strategy. Well, what are we actually talking about? I mean, are we talking about areas that have fallen into sort of just decay and we're going to bring them back as a local nature reserve or strategy or whatever? Well, I don't know.
I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is it's in order to enhance biodiversity. It's a strategy which will aim to that as its output to enhance biodiversity, and so it will be a sort of an action plan, I expect, of measures that will do that. But I think there's a lot of detail still required, and we can probably feed back further data at a later stage in the process.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I've got Karen and Adam, but Karen's spoken before, so I'll take Adam and then Karen in that order. Is that okay? I'll take Adam first and then Denise and then Marion.
Yeah, thanks. Staying on the GNLP consultation, I think the consultation response does emphasise that the public agree with our opinions of the proportion of housing development proposed for the village cluster areas. I think we all agree there's major concern over how sustainable that would be, how it fits in with our commitments to combat climate change and create sustainable communities. Just looking at the stats from the consultation, 75% of respondents opposed the approach to village cluster areas in the document. And looking at individual sites for the preferred development in Lingwood and Burlingham, Strumpshaw and Bayton, 79 out of 81 opposed the development. In Reedham, 49 out of 50 opposed the development. In Coltishall, Horsted with Stanning Hall and Below, 44 out of 45 opposed the development. And all but nobody approves of the development in Fowlsham and Themelthorpe, and only one person in Horsham and Newton Faith. So I think what the consultation does demonstrate is that the people of Greater Norwich do agree with this council's opinion of the village cluster, of the proportion of housing that should be built in the village cluster areas, and not those of the surrounding authorities. However, I do appreciate that, of course, this is a joint document, and that is the nature of it. But I just wanted to emphasise that point.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam.
Do you just want me to, Mike, want me to comment briefly on that? Because clearly the Greater Norwich local plan, following a decision to remove the village areas, village clusters as they're known in South Norfolk, they're being prepared by a separate process. So what you were talking about was the responses on the villages. Mostly, I think all those villages you mentioned are actually in Broadland, where the representations are in the plan. Clearly, as it's coming forward by a separate plan, we'll actually get consulted by South Norfolk on their village clusters plan, which means that at some point the City Council will be able to consider whether it wishes to make any representations on that plan. That hasn't been consulted on. I believe they're planning to consult on it in the autumn. So that's another matter that we may end up being reported through the panel for you to consider whether you want to separately comment on. The comments that you were there, it is not uncommon at this stage for the vast majority of people to comment on any site-specific allocation to comment negatively on it. That's the nature of the planning process. Even within the city, you will see, whilst the individual sites haven't had a large number of comments submitted on them, those that have been submitted do tend to be objections at this stage, and none of the numbers that have been received about those rural sites in Broadland are especially large, bearing in mind the significance of the allocations.
Thank you, Graham. So, if you don't mind, I'll do Denise and Mary, and then come back to Karen. Is that okay, Karen? Yeah, oh, that's right. I'll cross Karen off then. So, Denise.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, Graham, I've got 3 questions, please. Firstly, can you just go over again what the focused Regulation 18 consultation in November will focus on, please? Secondly, I want to ask, to what extent is funding for transport a soundness issue, given that there isn't enough funding to deliver bus rapid transit by 2026, as promised in the Joint Core Strategy, let alone further growth in the Greater Norwich local plan, such as the extension to Taverham? And then my third question is to really probe a bit more about the reasons for the delay to the Regulation 19 consultation, because the reasons given in this report, but also in the report to the GNDP, is that, well, several really, that there have been quite a number of submissions, but as you say, that the figures are not really anything out of the ordinary. Secondly, COVID-19 impact, but that's an issue that all planning authorities are dealing with. Thirdly, new government legislation in the pipeline, but that's really standard. And so my concern is that it comes down actually to the reason that you give in paragraph 15, and that is it's being delayed to allow progress on the Norwich Western Link, given that the county council is going to be putting in a planning application this autumn. And so you mentioned earlier that one of the issues for consultation in the autumn is county council and transport, and I'm a bit concerned that in fact the Norwich Western Link timetable is driving matters, driving the reasons for the delay, for example. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question. I think I've noted the 3 things that you wanted. In terms of what the consultation will cover in September, we don't know at this stage. We think what it will cover is it will cover transport issues, because there is an opportunity to do so, and I think I'm pretty confident that it will also cover consultation in relation to some of the additional sites that have been submitted on this latest consultation, simply because we've got the opportunity to do that. There may be other things that we feel we've got policy revisions that are sufficiently significant to enable consultation to carry out on it, and particularly I think some of our emerging evidence around the office space and the impact of COVID-19 may also feature in that, but that will be an exercise we go over the summer when we've completed the analysis, when the joint team's completed the analysis of the representations that have been made and reviewed its own evidence base. Your second question was whether funding for transport is a soundness issue, and what's a soundness issue is a matter for the planning inspectorate potentially. So a lot of people could try and persuade them that funding for transport was a soundness issue. My experience of dealing with planning inspectors over the years is that they tend to take a pragmatic view in relation to the matter, and would tend to the view that funding gets announced periodically, and we're planning for a period up to 2038. And so just because there isn't an evidence base suggesting how all the infrastructure is going to be funded over the duration of the plan period, they wouldn't say the plan is unsound because you cannot evidence that. At the moment, that certainly was the approach the inspectors took through the joint core strategy process some time ago. However, clearly the issue of deliverability and whether infrastructure can be delivered that will support the growth is really quite high on the list of soundness issues that they'll need the evidence around to consider when we get to examination. Your third question was around probing the reasons for the delay, and it isn't a case of the tail wagging the dog here. The delay to the local plan is not to allow consultation on the Western Link to take place. Clearly, we've had quite a large number of submissions. Practically, the team that was working away in County Hall have not been into County Hall for the past 4 or 5 months and are unlikely to return until beyond Christmas. That has had some operational impacts on them. They haven't been withdrawn from the team. None of the team have been redirected to other activities, but it is simply not as efficient, particularly when you're dealing with mapping issues and remote access to GIS systems. There is no substitute for being in an office with access to the technology as well as some of the team working. So it has slowed their activities. There is quite a significant number of issues that have been raised in submissions. As I say, our evidence in terms of the employment impact and the modelling thing was prepared prior to the impact of COVID. Frankly, our evidence base is now out of date in relation to it, and clearly there are some very significant announcements for government guidance. I think the end of the day, the risks, the discussion that took place at the GNDP, and certainly the officer perspective as it now is, if we simply tried to push ahead to the current timetable and effectively sought to finalise the submission version of the GNLP over the summer and put it through the decision-making process in the autumn with a view to the Regulation 19 consultation. I think the risks that we would perceive of that plan being unsound are too great for it to consider. So the obvious thing is to allow some time for us to digest the impacts of COVID-19, update the evidence to give us a better fighting chance of submitting a plan in the summer of next year, which will be sound and robust. That does allow scope for further consultation and the plan to reflect both the progress that the County Council is making on the Western Link scheme and also their intention to produce and review a Transport for Norwich strategy over the rest of this financial year, which they've sort of recently committed to. It would be a strange and indeed perverse outcome should we submit a plan in the summer of next year that doesn't have regard to the county council's intentions relating to transport policy generally, because integrating transport and land use is clearly what we should be aspiring to do through this process.
Okay, Denise. Good, thank you. Right, so I've got Councillor Marion Maxwell next.
Actually, my question was about transport, and thank you for answering that.
Okay, thank you. Any other councillors wishing to contribute? I mean, we're okay, Councillor Giles.
Thank you. Yeah, lots of be concerned about in the proposals coming from the government. Just wanted to focus in on the proposals that for a performance-related planning fee structure for local authorities, and giving successful appellants against refusals of planning applications the right to have their fees reimbursed by the local authority. And I was interested to hear Graham's thoughts on how that would impact us as an institution administratively and in terms of the cost impact for us. The second point I wanted to go in on was in terms of the Environment Bill and the additional obligations to make biodiversity net gain a mandatory requirement. That's obviously unlike the former, a welcome development. But my interest was whether Graham, in his professional opinion, believes developers have the required knowledge and understanding of ecology in order to meet these new additional requirements that may come in, and if not, how he sees the infrastructure surrounding the development sector developing to enable that knowledge base to build. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Two questions. The answers, the fees for appellants in the event of successful appeals against refusal, I'm not sure where those proposals stand in terms of being brought forward. I don't think they're in place yet. I don't know if any of the other officers who've been on the call are aware of that. Clearly, from the council's point of view, you know, in the light of the financial challenges the council is facing post-COVID, anything that creates even that risk of loss of income or the need to pay something out is particularly unwelcome. However, I think the point that you probably take some comfort from is that both the number of appeals that the council faces as a proportion of all the determinations we make is pretty low across Norwich, and our success rate at being able to justify and get decisions that support the council's determination of applications. And most of that is where the councils have refused applications and they're being appealed against. But as we've seen with Anglia Square, you can get call-ins where we've recommended approval and where council has resolved to approve an application. Our success rate, there's national league tables published in relation to appeal success rate, and currently and for some time now we have been pretty low in terms of the proportion of applications that have been appealed and our success rate where we are defending them, so pretty high in our success rate. So if both of those figures carry on, even if the government do press ahead and introduce something that is punitive to councils, we are going to be probably much less adversely affected by it than many other councils. So that's your first question. Second one, biodiversity net gain. and developers' understanding. I think there's issues about not only developers' understanding, but our own understanding of biodiversity net gain. And I think instead of worrying necessarily about the infrastructure in place on the development side of it to do it, I think one of the things we'll need to reflect on is whether we think there's a role for any guidance to be issued by the local planning authority to allow to explain how we are going to sensibly interpret that and offer, pragmatic, sensible solutions for how that biodiversity net gain can be delivered without frustrating development in Norwich. Because clearly, if we effectively create a very onerous planning system in Norwich, what that will serve to do is effectively drive certain forms of development outside of Norwich to where they would have a greater adverse impact on biodiversity and generally be less sustainable anyway, and clearly would not help the economy of Norwich in the way that we are in need of. So there's a balance to be struck in that, and I think there's an issue that we'll need to come back to in the autumn about how we provide sort of positive advice to the development industry to assist them in how they go about delivering that biodiversity net gain.
I'll unmute myself. Right, thank you, Graham. So I've got one indication from Councillor Graham, then I can see Councillor Davis and Councillor Maguire. So we'll do that in that order. So Councillor Graham.
Thank you. I've got two questions. One is about when we update our post-COVID, how that will happen and whether we'll be able to take into account the fact that fewer people are working, and of those people, fewer are commuting because they'll be working at home. And my other question relates to what you just said about biodiversity shouldn't be allowed to frustrate development. I find that quite alarming because actually biodiversity needs should be guiding development, and sometimes it should be frustrating it. Not always, but if we're going to talk about balancing needs, then we need to make sure that construction is biodiversity friendly and that it's in the right place. I mean, one thing that's been highlighted by lockdown is how important it is to people to have outdoor space. So I hope those things will be taken into serious consideration, and I'd like to hear how that will happen.
Okay.
We haven't specified all the evidence yet that particularly as the Greater Norwich Local Plan team is producing to deal with the impacts of COVID, but clearly what we will need to look at is where employment sort of quantities are heading, the number of people who will be in jobs, what nature of jobs, that we'll need to understand and facilitate growth in the sectors which employment could reasonably grow in, and what the spatial implications of that are. There's a significant challenge, and I think we need to understand it, particularly around city centre offices, and that relates back to the transport strategy as well, because clearly if fewer people are visiting the city centre on a daily basis, what that does for the space requirements. But I think it's too soon to leap to conclusions about that, and there's a wider piece to understand about where the future of the city centre sits, particularly in terms of offices, because it works at different levels. I think it's probably likely that at this stage, many of the employers that are based in the city will not want to go back to where they were in February. And so the large numbers of desks that were occupied by people who moved into the city in the morning and occupied those desks and went home, at the end of the day, that will probably reduce. But the wider question to me is how the city, how those trends exist across the wider Greater Norwich. So I think there may be more precedents in places that are outside of the city centre, So if some of the large floor plan offices where there's banks of desks around their offices may become places where people actually meet to be a bit more creative. There may be slightly smaller footprints, but I think there'll be a base for people to come periodically. So accessibility to a wider range of areas might be appropriate, and therefore the city centre may actually have a benefit in terms of provision of such offices. If you're only travelling into your office once or twice a week rather than 5 days a week, it may be more convenient to come into the city centre from a wider point of view. Sorry, my phone's just rung and it wasn't on silence, which I apologise. And there's also a wider trend about where things are regionally and nationally. I think there's some stuff I've seen that's quite interesting nationally, speculating that the London office market may be particularly affected by this because people now realise they don't need the very high value or high cost office provision in those other metropolitan centres. So the role of medium-sized regional cities may be actually strengthened as part of this. For those sort of touchdown bases, whatever. Anyway, we need to think all those issues through and specify the additional evidence to support the local plan submission next year. I don't think I can comment further at this stage, but doubtless what that future for city centre uses is going to be will have an impact on transport policies. You mentioned biodiversity and whether it should be frustrating development or not. Don't want to be sort of misinterpreted. I wasn't suggesting anything to suggest that the introduction of the net gain requirements wasn't anything other than positive here. And certainly our policy framework would say there are many parts of the city which should be protected for their biodiversity or their open space or other reasons and are unsuitable for development. The issue with biodiversity, though, is that there are many areas that are allocated for different forms of development, be that residential or industrial development of various sorts, that can and will have a significant biodiversity value. And the art of that is not having those restrictions or that requirement to deliver those net biodiversity enhancements, frustrate development in those sustainable areas that you want to see developed. It's providing guidance about how you can maximise the biodiversity benefit without creating an audit trail or a vast requirement for documents that doesn't add anything to the process overall. But Mike, before I complete, can I just ask you to bring in Catherine, who's our expert on biodiversity and who's also in on the Zoom call and will probably be far more coherent on the point than I am.
Good morning all, and thank you very much, Graham, for that. One thing I thought was worth raising is that there's a credit system that's been piloted by lots of local, well, I say lots, quite a few local authorities, and also Natural England looking at doing a pilot scheme. And so the bonus of that, as I see it, particularly for authorities like ours, is where developers have a site in somewhere like a city centre and they simply can't develop it with that 10% net gain at the site. There's an ability to effectively put money into this credit scheme, and the equivalent will then be spent elsewhere. So whether that's within our own city centre or whether it's potentially within the GNLP. So it allows developers to not opt out of it, but it's potentially sort of quite a reassuring way for developers to still come into the city and develop and know that there's that option. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you. Good. Okay. I'm going to move on now to Karen and then Kevin on the list.
Thank you.
We'll try and draw this to a close.
Yeah, I've got a couple of points. What Catherine was just saying about the credit scheme, great, you know, planting trees doesn't stop people from flying, does it? So that's not always really really net gain. But I want to come back to the appeals league tables that were mentioned, and the kind of general deregulation of the planning system overall by the government. Are we looking at a situation now where in a few years' time people are going to be sizing up different councils to see where they can get planning permission through, in the same way that people kind of size up which garage is going to pass their car through the MOT for the cheapest amount of money? Because it's looking to me like there's going to be a lot of development in areas where people think we're going to win this one. They've got appalling stats in the league tables, and I think the general level of deregulation is just going to exacerbate that.
Thank you for the question. Without getting drawn into a wider political debate that I think is appropriate, I think it's hard to speculate on where the planning system may be at the moment, but the general comment is, I don't think the performance indicators that the government use to monitor people drives behaviours particularly. They're not riveting reads, and I don't think a lot of the development industry spends time poring over them, going, this local planning authority's got a bad rate of defending its appeals, so we're going to try and promote development in it. I think the far bigger consideration is whether they've got 5-year land supply position for that particular aspect of the industry at the moment. But as I say, we're operating in a degree of uncertainty at the moment. I really we just need to reflect that uncertainty in the way we're doing it. I can't speak with any degree of confidence about what the planning system is going to look like or feel like in 2 years' time, let alone 5 years' time, without some further advice from government that we're expecting in forms of the future policy the policy statements that we're expecting within the month now. So I don't think I can be much more forthcoming on that point.
Okay, thank you, Graham. And then finally, Kevin.
Right, thanks, Chair. Graham, it's a simple question, but I'll just a little bit of background to it, and that is the fact that Adam's already alluded to the chiming of the public consultation and the city's own views about the plan and adequacy. And in particular, you'll recall I mentioned some of these again at the Greater Norwich Partnership to do with environmental issues and so on. With that in mind, we've obviously had the bite of the cherry that everyone has had, and then there's been the consultation. And I'm just wondering, in the inspector's process of examination, will that be the totality of her or his evidence, or do they then go out and seek further evidence, advice, and might there be further consultations, for example, or is this it?
Sorry, okay. This isn't it. The process that we go through would be, we're proposing a further bout of Regulation 18 consultation in the autumn. Then that becomes sort of it. The process requires the final plan to be drafted effectively. That needs to be subject to the final bout of consultation prior to submission. That's called Regulation 19 of the plan making process. At that stage, all you are asking is for people to express their views on the soundness or otherwise of the plan. The City Council as the submitting authority, or one of the three submitting authorities, will need to satisfy itself that the plan is sound at that point when it goes into government. Then the inspection that conducted by overseen by the planning inspector will address those soundness issues. there's quite broad leeway in what soundness issues may comprise. There's some statutory guidance that they must consider things like whether we have successfully cooperated with our neighbours, and there's various tests you've got to pass. But other than that, the inspectorate have a reasonable degree of leeway about where they go. They'll be able to delve into any of the evidence base they wish to in the examination process, and effectively the inspectorate will be able to call any of the parties who they have who've objected or made representations on the plan, and actually there's nothing to stop them if they wish to hear from other, government bodies or other people who haven't made representations, requesting them to appear before the examination and produce evidence. So it's quite an iterative, quite wide-ranging process that we go through. It is not at the end of the day at the moment. We are not at put up or shut up time. We are still in that process of considering our thinking, consulting on it, and taking an appropriate course of action in response to that revised evidence base.
So thank you, Graham. So we're receiving this for information, and we're making comments. We're not being asked to comment formally, say, to Cabinet at the moment. Just in terms of how we conclude this discussion.
Excuse me, Chair.
Yes.
Councillor Denise Carlo has indicated a couple of times.
Right. Okay. Can I just clarify before I bring Denise in? So, in terms of where we're, how we conclude this discussion, Graham, we're receiving this for information to update us. We're noting our comments that we've made, but we're not being asked to express a formal view at this point. Can I just clarify?
Yeah, that's correct. The purpose of producing this paper was to make sure Sustainable Development Panel were kept informed of the progress that was going on, had an opportunity to ask questions of where we were, make sure you're up to speed, because certainly when it comes back to the consultation in the autumn, and things hopefully are back to some sense of normality, what we've previously done is tried to have this debates at Sustainable Development Panel prior to equivalent meetings of the Greater Norwich Development Panel, so members can express their views and inform the comments of the members of at least the two members of this panel who are also on the GNDP, so we can take in that wide consensus of views and hopefully improve and influence the content of the Greater Norwich local plan. Just because of the impact of COVID and the fact that the GNDP didn't actually consider anything other than the timing for the plan, it wasn't possible to arrange that to that sort of timetable this time round. But hopefully when we go back into the autumn, we'll be meeting as an SDP prior to anything being published by the GNDP, so we can take members' views and feed that back into the GNLP process.
Fine, thank you, Greg, for clarifying that. So just as we're rounding up here on this one, we've got another item. So Councillor Carlo, did you have another question?
Yes, many thanks, yes, Chair. Graham, there were great differences between the GNDP members on climate change. I wondered if you could tell us where the debate has got to on that, please. That's my first question. The second question is really follows on from Leslie's question. You talked about COVID, the impact in relation to the city centre, but could you also talk about COVID in relation to transport and the road network, please? Because if as we've seen, fewer people commuting into work on a daily basis, obviously that's going to affect the traffic model, which looks at peak hours and traffic flows, and also future traffic forecasts. And obviously then that has an impact on what you might do, how you might address transport. Thank you very much.
Okay, quite quickly, because unfortunately I do have to go fairly shortly, but your point about climate change and the difference between the different parties, as you're well aware, city councils recognised a climate emergency, and we pushed for quite additional recognition of the climate issues within the plan, both in terms of some of its broader objectives and in terms of the some of the detailed policies that follow. There's been a measure of agreement reached, and actually I would comment that in some ways, I know there's a continuum here, but in some ways the representations the City Council has made have been successful in highlighting that issue and getting certainly statements of recognition of the significance of climate change into the Greater Norwich Local Plan. The devil will, as always, be in the detail of that, and the question is whether the development resulting from the Greater Norwich Local Plan will walk the walk in addition to having talked the talk, and clearly that'll be a matter that I expect will be extensively scrutinised through the forthcoming examination process, but certainly I think our position is we want it to do both, and that's what we will continue to push for as an authority within that process. Again, the point about COVID and the impact on transport, we don't really know where we're going to be in a few months' time, but there is absolutely an issue as at the moment. Transport traffic levels have changed quite significantly. Overall, they're still reduced because of the number of people who haven't returned to their traditional working patterns, and clearly public transport use is substantially down. Walking and cycling appears to have increased slightly as part of the thing. It makes it very difficult to do transport modelling at this particular stage because you're not clear on where your baseline is, nor indeed where you may be heading, and that's just one of the complexities that we will need to address in terms of the evidence base. It's a particular issue for the County Council and how they embark on the Transport for Norwich strategy review, but my comment on that is that invariably strategic documents like that can be informed by modelling, but the far more important thing is to have the vision right for those documents, and so you don't necessarily, so the absence of modelling and a sort of reliable baseline to calculate particular journey numbers and whatever on might actually be an advantage in terms of promoting creative thinking going forward, and shouldn't necessarily be a blockage to say that we cannot produce a transport strategy or an effective approach to transport in the absence of that reliable baseline from which to model.
Right, thank you, Graham. Now, I know Councillor Graham's indicated, but I also know that Graham is due to leave. He's pushed for time, so I'm going to, we've been talking about this for an hour and a quarter. I'm going to move on so that Graham can stay with us while we discuss the next item. If you've got any questions for Graham, Councillor Graham, then you can of course email him or give him a call. Thank you on that point. All our comments have been minuted. Let's move on, everybody, to item 5, and this is
thank you.
Something that's very welcome. So, who's introducing item 5?
And that's me. Thank you, Chair.
Sorry,
can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah. Yes, can do.
Okay. So this item is to seek your views on the need and possible introduction of an Article 4 direction to remove permitted development rights for the conversion of offices to residential within the Norwich city centre. So just in terms of the background, so permitted development rights were introduced back in 2013 to allow the change of use from office to residential without the need for full planning permission. And although they were initially introduced on a temporary basis in 2016, this was made permanent. So currently, as we've kind of already discussed, you only need an application for prior approval to do this. And the only things that you can consider are transport, contamination, flooding, the impact from noise on residential, from neighbouring residential uses, And as of the 1st of August, we'll also be able to consider whether there's adequate natural light in all the habitable rooms. But the other issues around amenity and the protection of employment land aren't things that you can take into account. So an Article 4 direction would remove this permitted development right, and it would allow the local planning authority to determine whether the proposed development is acceptable under its local plan policies. So officers undertook some initial research late last year and early this year, and we noted that there has been a significant loss in office floor space since the introduction of permitted development rights. And in total, 29% of Norwich's stock from 2008 has been lost, both through the prior approval process and through full applications. So the possible introduction of an Article 4 direction has been discussed previously by this group, and it's also set out within the emerging Norwich local plan that a key part should be to retain and grow employment in the city centre. And because there has been this loss of office accommodation, we need to reverse this. And there is one of the policies itself actually sets out that the city centre policy should provide the basis for the subsequent introduction of an Article 4 direction to manage the loss of B1A office floor space. However, in order to introduce an Article 4 direction, there needs to be a particularly strong justification for doing so. And we felt that we needed a stronger evidence base than we had. So in April this year, we commissioned Ramidus Consultancy to undertake this research in the form of a review of office accommodation in Norwich. So the study was primarily to be used to inform Norwich's town investment plan, but as part of the study, there's a section which focused on planning policy, and there's a specific part that we asked the consultants to review the existing evidence and to collect new evidence in order for us to be able to provide a case for or against the introduction of an Article 4 direction to restrict the uncontrolled loss of offices to residential. So you should have received a link to the full report, and there's also a very useful executive summary. But in general, the report found that Norwich's office market is actually very fragile and is in a very vulnerable condition. And it's also a lot smaller than it perhaps should be for the size of the city, and it underperforms compared with other cities. And also that the office market is actually shrinking, whereas you should have one of expansion. So the city centre is clearly the most sustainable location for office space, which means that and the report then found that the finite amount of employment land there actually does really need to be protected, as offices are crucial to Norwich's economy. So the report found that an Article 4 direction is required urgently. So as part of an Article 4 direction, you have to define the geographical area, and this was something that we asked the consultants to look into, and they proposed on a whole, the Norwich Inner Ring Road, so the A147, as the boundary for the Article 4, with an extension to cover the business space around Carrow Road, and also near the station on Thorpe Road. So in terms of the ring road, this would include anything that's just outside it as well. So you've got kind of marsh and those kind of places. So it would enable those to be controlled too. So as officers, we feel that this evidence base now demonstrates that there is a compelling case for the introduction of an Article 4 direction, and the study highlights that there is a need for this to be introduced as soon as possible. So there's two types of Article 4 directions. There's one which is a non-immediate direction, and there's one which is a direction which comes in with immediate effect. So an immediate direction withdraws permitted development rights straight away, but property owners whose land suffers a loss in value as a result of the direction could be entitled to compensation. So where a non-immediate direction is used, provided that the permitted development rights are withdrawn in the prescribed manner, then there would be no entitlement to seek compensation. So for this reason, all councils that I found that have introduced an Article 4 direction to control the loss of office accommodation have opted for the non-immediate option, with a 12-month notice period to avoid exposure to substantial future compensation claims. And this is what's been recommended for Norwich City Council. So in terms of the process, this is a relatively lengthy process. So first of all, an initial decision would need to be made by Cabinet to make the direction. You'd then have to serve notice by form of site notice, press notice, and where practicable, letters. And also you'd have to send a copy of the direction to the Secretary of State. We would then have to consider any representations received and decide whether or not to confirm the direction, taking into account the representations. If you decide to confirm the direction, you would need to serve notice again by press, site notice, and if practicable, letters to landowners and occupiers, and then send the direction to the Secretary of State. So the Secretary of State doesn't have to approve the Article 4 direction, but they do have the powers to intervene if they feel that there's a need to, so they can modify or cancel it. So I've set out briefly what I feel the timescales could be like. It is quite difficult to do this at the moment, one, because of staff resourcing being affected by COVID, and also we don't know yet the timetables for future SD panels and cabinets. But this sets out what I feel could be an achievable timescale. So we'd take the we would draft the Article 4 direction in August, and then that would be taken to Cabinet in September. We could serve notice in October this year, and the consultation period could end in November. Consider the representations in November, possibly bring it back to the SD panel at the end of the year in December, so take it to Cabinet in January, confirm it in January, serve notice in January, and then it would mean that the Article 4 direction could come into force around October 2021. Graham's has already spoken about the demolition of office buildings, and I've put a small section of that in my report. At the moment, we obviously don't know what that new permitted development right will look like, whether or not it would apply in conservation areas. So I think given the need to introduce this Article 4 direction as soon as possible, I think we should progress with this, keep an eye on what's happening, and then possibly if we needed to, you could have a second Article 4 direction to cover the demolition of office buildings, if there was a need to, if it did, you know, if conservation areas weren't excluded from it, for instance. So within my report, I've identified the risks that there are. So as already said, if you were to have immediate direction, you could have substantive compensation claims, but I think this would be mitigated by having a non-immediate direction. One of the other risks that I've identified, however, is that if you do have the non-immediate direction, you're likely to get a number of prior approval applications come in within the 12-month notice period. And the third risk that I identified is that although the Secretary of State doesn't have to approve the Article 4 direction, they can intervene. However, I feel that we've got strong enough evidence base that this is unlikely to happen. So I've also set out the resource implications. One of the main resource implications is staff resources and the consultation costs, but this could be covered by existing planning budgets. In terms of the study that was produced, none of that came out of the planning budget because it was used, as it's primarily used for the town investment plan, it came out of the town's deals side of things. And then in terms of costs, it would mean that a planning application fee would be payable if people had to apply for full permission rather than the prior approval, because prior approval applications attract very low fees, whereas the fee is a lot higher for a full application, but they do consider a full application does take considerable more officers' time. So that's kind of a very brief overview of it all, and the recommendation is that we recommend to Cabinet that the Council proceeds with the introduction of a non-immediate Article 4 direction. That's all for me at the moment. Thanks. If there's any questions.
Thank you, Joy. We have discussed this before. Actually, we've sort of drifted into a discussion of this in the previous discussion, which is kind of helpful in terms of bringing the two discussions together. We're looking at the need to make a recommendation to Cabinet, so that's where we need to end up with this. So the first thing I'll do is just take that was a really comprehensive journey through the issue, so thanks for that, Joy. But if there are any questions, then I'll take them now. I saw Denise and then I saw Judith.
Oh, I thought Leslie had. I think Leslie.
Shaking her head, actually, Judith. Yeah. So I think it's you.
Yes. Shall I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Yeah, Joy. Thank you very much for that background. I'm supportive of an Article 4, but I wanted to probe a bit more the reasons for it. I looked at the main report, and its starting point is, or its assumption is that change of use from office to residential has been the major factor, but in fact there have been the problem has been going on for far longer. I think the problem really started in the 1990s when the Southern Bypass was built, and it created a junction with the A47, or several, two junctions, east and west. And the one to the east of the city has developed as the Broadland Business Park. And in fact, there are something like 3 or 4 business parks now in the area. And so that's been a really huge influence on office space relocating from the city centre. Quite a lot of those companies have actually relocated from the city centre. For example, Aviva is the obvious one, but there are several others as well. And I've sort of followed this over the years because I had an interest in looking at how the offices have relocated in relation to new roads opening up. But a second factor is the fact that some of the office fabric in the city is poor quality and has been repurposed. For example, student housing has come along and has now occupied the 2 towers in St Stephen's. And so I think that was an important underlying factor, which probably is more important than offices changing to residential because of the change in government policy. And obviously then the bigger overarching picture is that there are 3 planning authorities in the Norwich area, and so Norwich is not in full control of land, which impacts on the city centre. And so I feel that that these factors ought to also be mentioned in the report, that in fact that government policy changing from office to residential is one factor, but it's not really the only factor. And as I say, the problem has been going on really since the early 1990s or mid 1990s. Thank you.
Okay, we'll leave those comments on the table to come back to. In terms of what we say to Cabinet. Judith wants to come in. Judith, you need to unmute.
Hi, sorry, just to come back in relation to the Ramidus report, it does talk about the need to promote offices as well in the city centre. It's not all about, because this is just one tool that we have in planning to protect office space, but it's about other factors, things as well that we can do. So the Ramidus report also looked at the possibility of having a digital hub in the city centre as well. So that's another plank in the armoury, and also just it proposes that we need to do a lot of promotion of offices as well. And obviously having a policy in the Greater Norwich local plan which sets out a vision for the city centre and talks about having a strong, vibrant office base in the city centre that this Article 4 direction will support is also really important, given that we are working with our other authorities in the Greater Norwich area on this as well. So just to give that slightly wider context.
I think also we can't ask for the report to be rewritten. What we can do is make comments to go with it to Cabinet. So we can, if we want to, incorporate just a comment on what you just said, Denise, but in the context of Judith's response. So let's move on now to the other Judith, Councillor Lubbock.
Yeah, yes. Thank you, Joy, for the report. I do support the idea of an Article 4 direction, and I think the evidence is there. And I think it's more about being in control so that we can adapt to different situations in the future. It may well be that, as Graham alluded to, that offices are used in a different way, and you know, they might change a bit. We don't want the individual sort of rooms, perhaps, it's open planned, and there may be other ideas of what might go into offices. Who knows? We're in a situation of change, and I think that if we have the Article 4, the direction 4, then at least we are in charge of things. We have the opportunity to look at the planning applications that come forward and to say yes or no. If we didn't have it, then, you know, people just have the permitted development rights. So I think it's a question of not necessarily giving us a chance to keep all the office space, because it could well be that we do allow some to go. It just depends where it is, the state it's in, you know, the suggested alternative use might be more valuable than the office. It puts us in a position of being in control, and that's why I think it's important to go forward with it and then take advantage of a changing world, you know, whatever that might be in a year's time, 2 years' time, 3 years' time. Thank you.
Thanks, Judith. I could see lots of people nodding while you were speaking. Kevin.
Thank you. So, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I mean, I welcome this, you know, for several reasons, but really well, two principal ones. One is the kind of accommodation that has been produced time and again as a result of the exercise of permitted development, and they have truly, well, we are well aware of one particular premises which has taken a lot of time and energy in legal proceedings because of the poor quality of conversion, and you know, it only gets worse, and you can end up then with the kind of contradictory situation of allowing a conversion because we have no say in the matter, and then with another hat on, with our Housing Act enforcement hat on, coming along and saying, well, you've built it according to permitted development, but it does not meet the housing standards of fitness, and so nobody can live in it. And imagine the uproar that would create. But the other main reason is this thing about, and it really essentially it's about Norwich as a place and place making, and what constitutes that that part of Norwich, the city centre, and keeping officers, encouraging people to come in, that vibrancy, you know. And I love the fact that Norwich is an industrial centre for the country because of its centrality of places like people like Marsh, that create this critical mass, yeah, that create this critical mass that then engenders itself and has its own community and economy, and this all feeds into Norwich as the place that it is. So some control on the loss of office space. I mean, surely that office space can be improved to become more attractive, but certainly the loss of it, anything we can do to mitigate, then I'm for, and I welcome this report.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm seeing lots of people nodding when people speak in favour of the recommendations. Yeah, I can see lots of nodding. See Councillor Graham nodding now as well. I can see Councillor Stootley wants to wants to speak.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'd like to investigate further the concept of bringing in an immediate article for direction. Have councils doing this, and were there any ramifications such as and also
Ian, I can't hear you. You're breaking up, Ian.
Okay, shall I start again?
Yes, please.
Okay, apologies for that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I was interested in the article for direction, the immediate direction. Whether there were any examples of other councils doing this, and whether there are any issues relating. I can see people
Ian, you've broken up again. I don't know what's happening, but so we know you want to.
I think it's my connection. I'll mute and write something in the.
Well, I think you were asking about the immediate direction and something about other councils.
Yes. Were there any examples that we can draw on
of people who did an immediate? Okay, that's fine. We'll go to Joy.
I haven't found a single council that has done an immediate Article 4 direction for an office to residential permitted development rights. I think that it could expose you to a significant amount of compensation claims, and I think for that reason nobody has done one.
Okay, does that answer your question, Ian? Ian's okay. Put his finger up. So I think, I mean, are we moving towards the recommendation and not to go for the immediate? Yeah, I can see people putting their thumbs up. Yeah, okay. I just sense that there's a lot of well, there is unanimity around this and around the recommendations. That doesn't surprise me. This is something that we've grappled with for some time. So are we ready to go to a vote on the recommendations? I think we are. Wow, good. Okay. So shall I do it the way we did it at council last night? So is there anybody against? No one against. Are there any abstentions? Okay, all those in favour? Yeah, that's unanimous. Great. I think that's really, really good decision we've made. I think we can all be very pleased with that. So the next thing is that will go to Cabinet, I believe, Joy. Brilliant. Thank you for the report, Joy. Thank you for presenting it so clearly. And thank you, everybody. That takes us to the end of the agenda. The next meeting is... Do we have a date for the next meeting, Jackie?
Sorry, no, we're still holding meetings as and when, but I will start looking at putting dates in diaries. There has been some discussion about moving dates to, no, I think we're all right on moving away from a Wednesday to a Thursday. I don't know what members think of that. The reason being is so that Graham Nelson can attend.
Yeah, that's fine. I
believe before the lockdown, I was having discussions with yourself and Councillor Maguire about that. So I just wanted to know, but I'll send something round to people and we'll have a look to see what.
Let's see what we can do. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
We'll see you all again soon.